There exists a text preserved in ancient Greek manuscripts that describes something unusual. A woman clothed with the sun. The moon is under her feet. 12 stars crown her head. She is pregnant, crying out in pain. And before her, waiting, is a red dragon, gigantic, with 7 heads and 10 horns. The dragon wants to devour the child as soon as it is born. This text is in the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation. It has been copied, translated, studied, and debated for nearly 2,000 years. But there is something strange happening with it. Depending on whom you ask, this woman could be 3 completely different people, or perhaps no person at all, or perhaps all of them at the same time. How can such a short text, consistently preserved in ancient copies, generate such opposing interpretations? Why has no one been able to define once and for all who this woman is? And more importantly, what was left out of the most repeated version of this story? If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take the opportunity now so you don't miss the next episodes. Warning, this documentary utilizes AI-generated images for illustrative purposes. Although the visuals are synthetic, the content is the result of rigorous research based on real historical and scientific sources. Sources in the description. Now notice this. In some very ancient Greek copies of Revelation, a note appears in the margin of the text. It is not part of the original. It was written by hand, much later, by someone who was trying to understand. The note says something like, "This is the Virgin." Simple as that, without explanation, as if it were obvious. But in other copies, preserved in different regions, the marginal note says something else. It says, "This is the church," also without explanation, and there are manuscripts with no note at all, the text alone, raw, with no one saying what it means. So try to visualize the scene. You have copists, separated by centuries and continents, looking at the same text and understanding completely different things, and each was certain they were right. Before entering into the interpretations, you need to understand what the text actually says. The 12th chapter of Revelation begins with the description of this woman. She appears in heaven. It is not clear if it is a vision, if it is symbolic, or if it is literal. The author does not explain. She is clothed with the sun. The moon is under her feet. 12 stars on her head. Pregnant, crying out, feeling the pain of childbirth. It is a very strong visual image. Anyone who hears this can assemble the scene in their head. But the problem begins immediately afterward. The dragon appears, great, red, 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns upon its heads. It uses its tail to drag 1/3 of the stars from heaven and throws them all to the ground. And it stands there, still in front of the woman, waiting. The text says it wants to devour the child as soon as it is born. Think about this. The text does not say why the dragon wants to do this. It does not say where it came from. It does not say if the woman knows the dragon. It does not say if she is trying to flee before the birth. It only presents the scene. A woman about to give birth, a dragon waiting, maximum tension. And then the child is born. It is a son. The text says that this son will rule all nations with a rod of iron. This is a direct quote from another ancient text, the 2nd Psalm. There, the phrase refers to the Messiah, so it seems the child is important. Very important. But immediately after the birth, something happens. The child is caught up, taken near to God, near to the throne, and the woman flees. She runs into the wilderness. The text says there is a place prepared for her there, a place where she will be sustained for a specific period of time, 1,260 days, and that is all. The text changes the subject. It does not explain what happened to the dragon at that moment. It does not explain how the woman reached the wilderness. It does not explain who prepared the place. Now comes the strange part. Right after this scene, the text describes a war in heaven. Michael, presented as an archangel, fights against the dragon along with other angels. The dragon also has angels on its side. They fight. The dragon loses. It is cast out, thrown to the earth. And then comes the identification. The text says that this dragon is the ancient serpent, the one from the beginning, the serpent of the Garden of Eden, and it is also called the devil and Satan. So, finally, there is a clear identification. The dragon is not just an abstract symbol. It has a name. It has a history. It is connected with the beginning of everything. But the woman, nothing. The text does not say her name. It does not say where she came from. It does not connect her with any other specific story. And is this intentional, or is it a gap? No one knows. Notice what happens next. The dragon is thrown to the earth. It knows it has little time, and the text says it becomes furious. It goes after the woman, but the woman receives wings, wings of a great eagle, and she flies to the wilderness, to the place that was prepared. She stays there being sustained for a time, times, and half a time. This is an expression that appears in other ancient apocalyptic texts. No one knows if it is literal or symbolic. The dragon tries to destroy the woman. It casts water from its mouth like a river. It wants the woman to be swept away by the current. But the earth helps the woman. The earth opens its mouth and swallows the river, and the dragon becomes even more furious. It gives up on the woman and goes to make war against the rest of her offspring. Who is this offspring? The text says, those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. So the story does not end with the birth of the child. It continues. The persecution continues. And now it involves a much larger group of people. Follow me. The text has three moments. First, the birth and the flight. Second, the war in heaven and the expulsion. Third, the persecution in the wilderness and the attack on the offspring. It seems like a chronological sequence, but perhaps it is not. Some ancient scholars read this as if all events were happening at the same time, only described from different angles. Others read it as if it were a literal timeline. Birth of the Messiah, spiritual war, persecution of the church. Each reading completely changes the meaning, and there is no consensus to this day. Now let us go to the interpretations. The first great dispute is over the identity of the woman, and here the problems begin. There are at least three main interpretations that have crossed the centuries, and each has evidence, each has defenders, and each leaves questions unanswered. The first interpretation is the oldest we can trace in preserved texts. It says that the woman is Israel, the people of Israel, the nation, the community, not an individual person. There are some strong reasons to think so. First, in the book of Genesis, there is a dream. Joseph dreams of the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing down before him. His father, Jacob, interprets the dream. He says that the sun and the moon represent him and his wife. The stars represent the sons, the family, the 12 tribes of Israel. So when Revelation describes a woman with the sun, the moon, and 12 stars, it seems like a direct reference. The woman would be Israel, and the stars would be the 12 tribes. This makes sense within the Jewish context. Second, there are several texts in the ancient prophets that speak of Zion, of Jerusalem as a woman in birth pains, a woman waiting for liberation. Isaiah does this, Micah does this, Jeremiah does this. It is a recurring image, the city or the people personified as a woman who is about to give birth to something new, liberation, hope, restoration. If you read Revelation with this tradition in mind, it makes sense to see the woman as Israel giving birth to the Messiah. The child who will rule the nations is Jesus, born from within the people of Israel. And then comes the persecution, Israel being persecuted, scattered, protected in the wilderness. The wilderness was always a place of trial and protection in Jewish history. The Exodus, the 40 years, The wilderness is not punishment, it is refuge. This interpretation dominated much of the ancient tradition. Christian writers of the first centuries read it this way. But then something changed. Over time, especially within the tradition that would come to be called Catholic, the woman began to be identified with Mary, the mother of Jesus. And here things get interesting. Why did this change happen? Part of the explanation lies in devotion. As generations passed, Mary gained an increasingly central place in Christian spirituality. She was seen not only as the mother of Jesus, but as a figure of purity, of obedience, of participation in the divine plan. And Revelation 12 has a woman who gives birth to the Messiah. So the question began to arise. Could this woman not be Mary? After all, Mary literally gave birth to Jesus. She literally is the mother of the child who will rule the nations. The connection seems obvious. But there are problems. The text says, the woman flees into the wilderness. Did Mary flee into the wilderness? Not in the gospel accounts. The text says, the woman receives eagle wings and flies. Did Mary fly? The text says, the dragon pursues the woman and attacks her offspring. Who is this offspring if the woman is Mary, Christians in general? But why would the text speak of Mary individually and then change to a group? These questions have no easy answers. But the Marian interpretation grew, and over time it was reinforced by official documents, by art, by liturgical tradition. Images of Mary clothed with the sun, crowned with stars, treading upon the serpent, became common. Baroque iconography consolidated this. You see paintings, sculptures, stained glass, all connecting Mary with the woman of Revelation. And in later theological documents, the identification was treated as natural, almost unquestionable. But then came the Reformation, and the reformers looked at the text and said, no, this woman is not Mary. It cannot be. The woman represents the church, the community of the faithful, the people of God throughout all history. John Calvin wrote about this. Other reformers did as well. For them, interpreting the woman as Mary was an error. It was placing an individual person in the place of a collective symbol. The woman, according to this reading, is the church giving birth to Christ? Not exactly. The church preserving the message of Christ, the church being persecuted, the church in the wilderness sustained, protected, but constantly threatened, and the offspring of the woman. All Christians, all those who keep the commandments and have the testimony of Jesus. Does it make sense? It does. Does it resolve all the problems of the Marian interpretation? Also no. Because if the woman is the church, how to explain that she gives birth to the child who is Christ? The church did not give birth to Christ. Christ founded the church, not the contrary. So some said, no, the woman is the people of God in the broadest sense. Israel and the church together. The continuity of the promise. Israel gave birth to the Messiah. The church continues to be persecuted. The woman represents both. Historical continuity. But this also has problems because the text does not make this dual identity clear. It presents one woman, one figure, and leaves open who she is. Now pay attention to this detail. The text itself, in the ancient Greek manuscripts, has not changed. It is there, preserved in the same way in copies made in different regions and eras. Papyrus 47, which contains parts of Revelation and is from the mid-3rd century, has the text consistently with later manuscripts. Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century, Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th. All agree on the text, the woman clothed with the sun, the dragon, the birth, the flight. There are no significant variations in the words, but the interpretations changed completely over time. Does this mean the text is ambiguous on purpose? Or does it mean each generation projected onto it what it wanted to see? Or does it mean the text contains intentional layers and all interpretations capture part of the truth? There is another element that complicates it even further: the apocalyptic genre. Revelation is not a common text. It belongs to a specific tradition of Jewish and early Christian literature. Apocalyptic texts use symbols, visions, numbers, cosmic images. They speak of spiritual realities using earthly language, and they speak of earthly realities using celestial language. It is a purposeful mixture. The book of Daniel does this. The book of Enoch does this. Texts found at Qumran do this. And Revelation does this even more intensely. So when the text describes a woman in heaven, clothed with the sun, is this literal? Is it symbolic? Is it a mystical vision? Is it a historical metaphor? Perhaps it is, all at the same time, and perhaps the author wanted exactly that, to leave it open, to allow multiple readings, because the symbol is more powerful than the definition. Notice how the text works. It gives very specific visual details: 7 heads, 10 horns, a third of the stars, 1,260 days, concrete numbers, concrete images. But it explains nothing. It does not say, the woman represents this, the dragon represents that. It presents the scene and lets the reader process it. And this is typical of apocalyptic literature: dense symbols, layers of meaning, references to other ancient texts, all together, all at the same time. There is something else that needs to be considered: the historical context of when the text was written. It is impossible to know the exact date, but most scholars place the writing of Revelation sometime at the end of the 1st century. There are those who argue for slightly earlier dates. There are those who argue for slightly later dates. But the general consensus points to a period of tension. Christian communities scattered throughout Asia Minor. External pressure, internal conflicts. Revelation is addressed to 7 specific churches: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, all in the region that is now Turkey. And each of these churches receives a particular message in the first chapters: praises, criticisms, warnings, promises, and then comes the sequence of visions: seals, trumpets, bowls, beasts, battles. And in the middle of all this, in chapter 12, this woman appears. Why just there? Why exactly at this point in the narrative? Some suggest that chapter 12 functions as an interlude, a pause, an explanation of what is really happening behind the events described before. The war is not just political. It is not just earthly persecution. There is a spiritual dimension, a cosmic conflict, and the woman is at the center of this conflict. She gives birth to something that changes everything, and for that reason, she is persecuted. Not by accident, not for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but because she carries something that threatens the dragon. Think of the structure of the text. First, the woman and the dragon. Second, the war in heaven. Third, the persecution on earth. It is as if the author were showing the same conflict from 3 perspectives: celestial, spiritual, historical, and all are connected. What happens in heaven affects the earth. What happens on earth reflects heaven, and the woman is in both places. She appears in heaven. She flees to the earth. She is in both the spiritual dimension and the physical dimension. Or perhaps she represents something that transcends this division. Now look at the dragon. It is identified clearly: ancient serpent, devil, Satan. There is no ambiguity in its identity. Why then does the woman remain without explicit identification? Would it be a failure of the author, forgetfulness? Or would it be intentional, to leave the symbol open so that each community, each generation, each reader could recognize themselves in it? If the woman is Israel, then the Jewish people can see themselves there. If the woman is Mary, then Marian devotion finds a foundation. If the woman is the church, then every Christian can recognize themselves as part of the persecuted offspring. All these readings coexist, And perhaps the text allows this on purpose, but there is a tension that was never resolved. If you accept all interpretations as valid, the text loses specificity. It becomes everything and nothing at the same time. If you choose one interpretation and reject the others, you have to explain why the text allows such different readings, and none of the explanations is totally satisfactory, because the text is there, preserved, repeated, copied, but never explained by the author himself. Revelation does not have a final chapter saying, "Now I will explain all the symbols." It ends with more visions, more promises, more warnings. And it leaves the reader with the images in their head. The woman, the dragon, the child, the wilderness, the war, the persecution. So what do we know for sure? We know that the text exists. We know that it was preserved consistently. We know that early Christian communities read this text and discussed the meaning. We know that over the centuries, different interpretations arose, each with arguments, each with tradition, each with theological consequences. We know that none of these interpretations managed to eliminate the others. And we know that to this day, when someone reads the 12th chapter of Revelation, the first question that arises is, who is this woman? And perhaps the most honest answer is, it depends on who is reading, and when they are reading, and what they are seeking in the text. Because the text itself has not changed. The words remain the same, but the meaning remains in dispute. There is a strange thing in the text that we need to look at more closely: the dragon. Most people focus on the woman, who she is, what she represents, why she is being persecuted. But the dragon is perhaps more complicated than it seems, because the text gives it several names, several identities, and each of these identities carries its own story. The ancient serpent, the devil, Satan, the accuser of the brethren. 4 names, or 4 functions, and the connection between them is not as obvious as it seems. It begins with the physical description: great red dragon, 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns upon the heads. This is not a random description. Each number has weight. 7 appears constantly in apocalyptic texts: 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. 7 is a number of completeness, of totality. 10 as well. 10 horns. In other prophetic texts, horns represent power, authority, kingdoms, so the image is of total power, total control, total authority, but fragmented. 7 heads, not one. So there is multiplicity, there is division within unity, and the crowns are only upon the heads, not upon the horns. Some later manuscripts have notes trying to explain this, but the original text does not explain. And there is the red. Color matters. In apocalyptic texts, colors always matter. Red can be blood, it can be war, it can be destruction, but it can also be empire. Rome was associated with the color red in some ancient records. Roman soldiers wore red cloaks. The insignias were red. So when Christian communities at the end of the 1st century read about a great red dragon with multiple centers of power, did they think only of something spiritual? Or did they also see a veiled reference to the empire that surrounded them? It is impossible to be certain, but the possibility exists. Now comes the identification. The text says clearly, this dragon is the ancient serpent, the one called devil and Satan. First thing, ancient serpent. This connects with Genesis, the serpent in the garden, the temptation, the fall. But notice an interesting thing. In Genesis, the serpent has no name. It is just a serpent, cunning, deceiver. But at no point does the text of Genesis call the serpent Satan. This connection was made later, in later texts, in interpretations, in oral traditions that were preserved and eventually written down. So Revelation is making a retroactive connection. It is saying, that serpent back at the beginning, it was this dragon here. It always was. And there is the word Satan. In Hebrew, Satan means adversary, opponent, accuser. It is a function before it is a name. In the book of Job, there is a figure called Satan, the Satan. He appears before God along with the sons of God. He questions Job's integrity, he accuses, he tests, but in that context he is not necessarily malignant by nature. He exercises a function, he is like a prosecutor, and God allows him to act. But over time, in texts written between the period of the Old and New Testaments, texts that did not enter the official canon but circulated widely, the figure of Satan was transformed. He ceased to be just an accuser and became a rebel. He became an active enemy. He became the leader of fallen angels. And Revelation assumes this already developed tradition. The text says, "There was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and its angels fought back. But they did not prevail, and there was no longer a place for them in heaven, so they were expelled. The great dragon was cast down to the earth, and its angels with it." And then comes a declaration. A loud voice in heaven proclaims, "Now has come the salvation, the power, the kingdom of God, and the authority of the Christ. For the accuser of our brethren has been cast out, he who accused them day and night before God." Think about this. Accuser day and night. This suggests a constant activity, systematic. It is not an occasional attack. It is permanent work, and it happens before God. So the image is of a court. There is accusation, there is defense, there is judgment. And the accuser was expelled. Why? The text says, "Because they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they did not love their own lives unto death." So there is a victory, but it is not by military force, it is by testimony, by fidelity, by a willingness to die. This is strange. It is a spiritual war, but the weapons are different. Now there is a detail in the manuscripts that few have noticed. In some ancient Greek copies, there is a small variation in the order of the words when the text describes the expulsion of the dragon. Most manuscripts say he was cast down to the earth and his angels with him. But there are at least 2 copies preserved in different regions that invert it slightly. His angels were cast down and he with them. The difference is subtle, but the ice changes the emphasis. In one version, the dragon is the principal and the angels follow. In the other, there is a collective fall, and the dragon is included in it. Scholars discuss whether this is a copying error or an intentional variation. There is no consensus, but it shows how even small details in the text could be copied in slightly different ways. And after the expulsion, the text says, "There is joy in heaven. But woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath. He knows he has little time." Little time for what? The text does not explain. Little time until the end? Little time until he is completely defeated? Little time until something specific happens? It remains open, but the feeling is of urgency, of desperation. The dragon knows it will lose, so it intensifies the attack, and then comes the persecution of the woman. The dragon was cast down to the earth. It saw the woman who had given birth to the son, and it pursued the woman, but the woman received 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly to the wilderness, to her place, a prepared place, where she is sustained for a time, times, and half a time, away from the face of the serpent. Notice the changes in vocabulary. First it is dragon, then it becomes serpent again. It is the same creature, but the text alternates. Dragon when speaking of power, war, expulsion. Serpent when speaking of earthly persecution, deception, continuity with the story of Eden. And there is the expression, "a time, times, and half a time." This appears in the book of Daniel. There it refers to a period of persecution, 3.5 years, or 42 months, or 1,260 days. All these expressions appear in Revelation at different moments. They seem to refer to the same period. But why does the text use various ways of saying the same thing? perhaps to connect with different traditions, perhaps to create a sense of a pattern, perhaps to leave the interpretation open, because 3.5 years is half of 7, and 7 is completeness, so it is incomplete time, limited time, time that will end. The dragon tries to destroy the woman. It casts water from its mouth like a river. It wants to sweep the woman away, but the earth helps. The earth opens its mouth and swallows the river. This echoes another ancient story. When the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea, the sea swallowed the army that pursued them. When Korah rebelled against Moses in the wilderness, the earth opened and swallowed the rebels. So there is a tradition of natural elements intervening in moments of crisis. And here it happens again. The woman is being attacked. The earth intervenes, and the attack fails, but the dragon does not give up. It becomes wroth with the woman and goes to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So the conflict expands. It is no longer just about the woman. It is no longer just about the child who was born. Now it involves a much larger group, and this group is identified specifically. They keep commandments. They have testimony. These are active characteristics. It is not something passive. It is a choice. It is a posture, and for that reason they become a target. Now let us go to something that is rarely mentioned. Chapter 12 ends like this, "And the dragon stood upon the sand of the sea." In some translations it says, "And he stood upon the sand of the sea," but in others it says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea." The difference lies in a single letter in the Greek, and the manuscripts diverge. Some copies have one form, other copies have another. If it is "he stood," the dragon is waiting for something. It is positioning itself. If it is "I stood," it is John, the author of the vision, who is positioning himself to see what comes next. And what comes next? Chapter 13, "Where a beast arises from the sea." So the position matters. Who is standing on the sand? The observer or the dragon? And depending on the answer, the connection between the chapters changes. There is another element that needs to be considered: the war in heaven. Michael fighting against the dragon. Michael is mentioned in few places in the scriptures. In the book of Daniel, he is described as one of the chief princes, a protector of the people of Israel. In the book of Jude, there is a brief reference to Michael disputing with the devil over the body of Moses. And here in Revelation, he leads the war against the dragon. But the text does not say that Michael defeated the dragon alone. It says that Michael and his angels fought. And it says they overcame because of the blood of the Lamb. So the victory is not Michael's, it is the Lamb's. Michael is an instrument, an executor, but the cause of the victory lies elsewhere. And there is a question that almost no one asks. If the dragon was expelled from heaven at this moment, when was it there before? The text does not say. It simply presents the expulsion as an event. But in other ancient traditions, preserved in texts that circulated among early Jewish and Christian communities, there are stories of an original rebellion, of angels who turned against God, of a primordial fall. The Book of Enoch, for example, which is not in the official canon but was widely read, speaks of fallen angels, of Azazel, of Semyaza, of celestial beings who descended to earth and caused corruption. These traditions were in the air, and Revelation seems to assume that the reader already knows at least part of them, because it does not explain, it only presents. So what is the text actually saying about the dragon? Is it saying it is real? Is it saying it is a symbol? Is it saying both? The description is visual: 7 heads, 10 horns, red, concrete. But at the same time, the text connects this figure with ancient traditions, with multiple names, with spiritual functions: accuser, deceiver, adversary. So perhaps the text is operating on 2 layers at the same time. There is a real spiritual enemy, and there are earthly powers that manifest this same opposition. The dragon is both, or rather, the dragon represents the source, and there are earthly manifestations of that source. And this leads back to the woman. If the dragon pursues the woman, and if the dragon represents radical opposition to the divine plan, then the woman represents something that is at the center of that plan. That is why she cannot be defined simply. She carries multiple dimensions. Israel, from whom the Messiah came. Mary, who literally gave birth. The church, which continues witnessing. All these dimensions are under attack, and all these dimensions are preserved. The wilderness is not defeat. It is protection. It is sustenance. It is continuity. Notice how the text intertwines celestial events and earthly events. The war happens in heaven, but the expulsion affects the earth. The woman appears in heaven, but flees to the wilderness on earth. The child is born of a woman, but is caught up to the throne of God. There is no clear separation between the dimensions. They overlap, they interpenetrate, and this is purposeful, because the conflict is not just spiritual, and it is not just political, it is both, it is total, and there is the offspring. Those against whom the dragon goes to make war. The text identifies them. They keep the commandments of God. They have the testimony of Jesus. So there are criteria. It is not everyone. It is not a vague group. It is those who actively maintain a specific posture. And for that reason, they become a target. The persecution is not random. It is directed. It is intentional. And it is described as war. Not as an inconvenience, not as a difficulty, war. So when you put it all together, what emerges? A narrative of cosmic conflict that has real historical consequences. An enemy identified in multiple ways, a woman preserved but persecuted, an offspring under permanent attack, and a victory already declared, but not yet completely realized on earth. It is this tension that the text sustains. The war has already been won in heaven. The accuser has already been expelled. But on earth, the persecution continues. For a time, for times, for half a time. And perhaps the most disturbing thing is this. The text does not promise an immediate end to the persecution. It promises protection, sustenance, final victory. But it recognizes that the offspring will be attacked, that there will be war, that the dragon, knowing it has little time, will intensify its wrath. It is a realistic message. It does not deny suffering, but it places suffering within a larger framework, within a conflict that began before and will end after. And this completely changes how one reads their own present situation. The communities that received revelation were under pressure. Some faced active persecution, others faced cultural seduction. Others faced internal divisions, and the text says, this is not an accident. You are in the middle of a war that has a spiritual dimension. And you are not alone. There is a woman being preserved. There is a child who has already overcome. There are Michael and his angels. There is the blood of the Lamb. And there is an offspring that maintains testimony even under attack. You are part of this offspring, and for that reason you are a target. But for that reason, you are also protected. And the dragon knows it will lose. That is why it is wrath. That is why it is desperate. That is why it intensifies the attack. But its time is limited. It has already been decreed. It has already been revealed, and the narrative continues. There is a document preserved from a very ancient period. A letter. It is not complete. Parts were lost. But what remains is interesting. The letter was written by someone named Victorinus of Petau. He lived sometime in the 3rd century, and he wrote a commentary on Revelation, one of the first that survived. In this commentary, when he reaches chapter 12, Victorinus does something specific. He says that the woman is the ancient church, the church of the patriarchs, the prophets, the saints. And that she gives birth to Christ. But then he adds something curious. He says that the woman is also the present church, which continues to generate spiritual children daily. So for him, the woman has a dual temporal identity, past and present, at the same time, and he sees no problem in this. For him, the symbol contains both. But Victorinus died as a martyr. There is a record of this. He was executed during one of the waves of persecution. And when you read his commentary knowing this, certain things gain weight. When he speaks of the persecution of the woman, when he speaks of the dragon attacking the offspring, he is not speaking of something abstract. He is speaking of his reality, of the people around him, of the communities he knew. The text was not theoretical. It was a mirror. Now jump a few centuries. There is another document, a commentary made by someone named Tychonius. He lived in North Africa sometime at the end of the 4th century. Tychonius had a completely different reading. For him, the woman represented a dual reality, true church and false church, mixed, and the conflict was not just external. It was internal as well. He read Revelation as a description of a battle within the Christian community itself, between those who maintained fidelity and those who yielded, between authentic testimony and accommodation. And the dragon. It attacked from without, but also worked from within, through false doctrines, through corrupt leaders, through divisions. Tychonius was not inventing, he was dealing with real schisms. The Donatist controversy divided entire communities in North Africa. There was a dispute over who the true Christians were, who had authority, who had preserved the purity of the faith. And Tychonius saw Revelation speaking directly about this, the woman in the wilderness. It was the true community, preserved in the midst of chaos, the persecuted offspring. It was those who did not yield, even under political and ecclesial pressure. And here a pattern begins to become visible. Each generation that read Revelation 12 saw its own situation reflected in the text, not because the text changed, but because the circumstances were always different, and the text had enough symbolic openness to speak to all of them. Jump a few more centuries, there are records of intense debates over Revelation during the medieval period, and something interesting happens. The identification of the woman with Mary becomes increasingly strong. It was not the decision of one person. It was a gradual process. Sermons, popular devotion, art, liturgy, everything reinforcing itself. And at some point, for many communities, the connection was already so established that questioning it seemed strange. The woman clothed with the sun was Mary. Obvious, natural, unquestionable. But there are documents that show resistance. Not everyone accepted this reading easily. There are preserved treatises where medieval theologians argue about the meaning of the text. Some defend the collective interpretation. The woman is Israel and the church. She cannot be reduced to a single person. Others defend that there are layers, Mary individually, but also something larger that she represents. And some simply say, it is Mary, period. And each side had arguments. Each side cited ancient authorities. Each side saw itself as the guardian of the correct interpretation. And then comes the Reformation. And then everything explodes, because the Reformers looked at the Marian tradition that had developed and said, this is a problem. This has deviated from the text. This has placed human devotion in the place of the central message. And they returned to the argument. The woman cannot be Mary because the text speaks of persecution, of flight, of an offspring attacked. Mary did not flee into the wilderness. Mary did not have multiple offspring being pursued by the dragon, so the Marian reading does not hold. It must be a collective symbol. But here it gets interesting. The Reformers were not just doing neutral exegesis. They were in direct conflict with Rome. And when they said that the woman represented the true persecuted church, they were saying, we are that church. We are the offspring being attacked, and the dragon working through the institutions that persecute us. So the text became a weapon, it became validation, it became identity, and the Catholic side responded. Official documents reaffirmed the Marian interpretation. Baroque art filled churches with images of Mary crowned with stars. Sermons connected Revelation 12 with Marian doctrines. It was not just biblical interpretation. It was an affirmation of theological identity. It was a defense of tradition. It was a symbolic war being waged through an ancient text. And the text? The text remained the same, preserved in manuscripts, copied, translated, but each side read and saw different things, not because the text was vague, but because the text had symbolic density that allowed multiple entries, and each group entered through the point that made sense for its own experience. Now there is a strange silence that needs to be noted. There is very little material preserved from ancient Eastern Christian communities commenting on Revelation. The Orthodox tradition, which developed in Greek, the same language as the original text, did not produce as many detailed commentaries on Revelation as the Western tradition. Why? There are several theories. One of them is liturgical. Revelation was not included in the regular liturgical reading in many Eastern churches, so it was not a text that people heard constantly. It was not a text that needed to be explained every year in sermons, so it did not generate the same amount of commentary. But the commentaries that do exist are fascinating. There is a text attributed to Andrew of Caesarea from sometime around the 6th century. He comments on Revelation, and when he reaches chapter 12, he does something particular. He says that the woman can be seen in 3 ways: as the church of the Hebrews that generated Christ according to the flesh, as the church of the Gentiles that generates Christ in the hearts of believers, and as the Theotokos, the God-bearer, Mary. 3 readings, not mutually exclusive, coexisting. For Andrew, it was not necessary to choose one and reject the others. The symbol accommodated all, and this raises a question. When in the West did interpretations become mutually exclusive? When did it cease to be possible to say, the woman is this, and also that? When did it become, the woman is this or that? It seems to have been a gradual process. As theological divisions deepened, as sides defined themselves more rigidly, interpretations also hardened. Symbolic flexibility became a problem. Ambiguity became weakness. It was necessary to fix the meaning, to control the reading, to establish orthodoxy. But there are discordant voices preserved. There are manuscripts with marginal notes made by individual readers, not official theologians, not famous commentators, just ordinary people who read the text and wrote what they thought. And in these margins you find interpretations that do not fit perfectly into any of the established traditions. Someone wrote beside the text, "The woman is every soul that seeks Christ." Another wrote, "This happened, is happening, and will happen." Another wrote simply, "Mystery." These notes were preserved because they were in manuscripts that survived, but how many others were lost? How many personal, communal, regional readings simply disappeared because the manuscripts containing them deteriorated? And there is another element rarely mentioned. Revelation was translated into several ancient languages: Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Ethiopic, Armenian. And translations are not neutral. A translator makes choices, and these choices can influence interpretation. The Greek word for woman, gyne, is direct, but when you translate into another language, you can use a word that carries specific connotations. You can use a term that emphasizes motherhood, or a term that emphasizes nobility, or a neutral term, and depending on the choice, readers in the target language will have slightly different perceptions. There is a concrete example of this. In some ancient Syriac versions, the woman is called with a term that can also mean wife, in others with a term that emphasizes mother. Both are valid translations of the Greek, but they create nuances. If you read wife clothed with the sun, you might think of a conjugal relationship, the church as the bride. If you read mother clothed with the sun, you think of generation. Israel generating the Messiah, Mary generating Jesus, the church generating Christians. Small differences in words, large differences in the mental image. Now comes something disturbing. There are records that some groups, considered heretical by the main traditions, also read Revelation, and they saw completely different things. There are preserved fragments of Gnostic texts that mention the woman of Revelation, and for them the woman represented Sophia, divine wisdom, the feminine aspect of the divinity, fallen, redeemed, in conflict with the demiurge, the imperfect creator. It is a totally different reading. It uses the same base text. It arrives at completely different places, and it was suppressed. It did not enter the official tradition. It was marked as error, as deviation, as danger. But it existed. It was read. It was taught, and it left traces. The uncomfortable question is, how many other readings were suppressed? Not because they were necessarily wrong, but because they did not fit into what the established authorities wanted the text to say. There are documents from ancient councils discussing which books should be considered scripture, and there are later documents discussing how these books should be interpreted. Control of the text, control of the meaning, control of the community through the control of the reading. But the text is resistant. It does not allow itself to be controlled completely. Even with all the tradition, all the authority, all the official interpretations, the text continues to generate new readings. In the modern period, with historical critical methods, scholars began to ask, what did the original author mean? Not what tradition says, not what the church teaches. What was the author writing at the end of the 1st century, in a specific context, for specific communities, trying to communicate? And then readings arise that focus on the historical context: Rome, empire, persecution, imperial cult, economic pressure on Christians who did not participate in the trade systems linked to pagan temples. And Revelation becomes a text of resistance. The woman is the faithful community. The dragon is the imperial system. The war in heaven is a spiritual conflict that manifests in political reality. This reading has strength. It has evidence. But it also has limits, because if you reduce the text only to the historical context of the 1st century, you lose the layers of symbolism that connect with older traditions. You lose the intertextual richness. So today, there are multiple schools of interpretation coexisting. There are historical readings, there are traditional theological readings, there are literary readings that analyze the text as apocalyptic literature without necessarily affirming theological truth. There are liberation readings that see in the persecuted woman a symbol of oppressed communities in any era. There are feminist readings that question why the woman is always interpreted through masculine categories. She is Israel, she is Mary, she is the church. But what if the woman is simply a woman, a powerful, creative, persecuted, preserved feminine figure? What does that say? And all these readings exist because the text allows them, not because the text is vague, but because the text operates on multiple layers. It connects with Genesis, with the prophets, with the history of Israel, with the early Christian experience, with Jewish apocalyptics, with messianic expectations, all at the same time, and each reader, each community, each era takes the connections that make sense for their situation. There is one last element that needs to be considered. The text speaks of offspring, those against whom the dragon makes war. And throughout history, countless groups have identified themselves as this offspring. persecuted Christians in the Roman Empire, monastic communities in the wilderness, reform movements, minority churches, dissident groups, communities under oppressive regimes, all read the text and said, "This is about us. We are being attacked, but we are being preserved, and the dragon has little time." This identification with the text is not abstract. It generates courage. It generates resistance. It generates a sense of purpose. If you believe you are in the middle of a cosmic conflict described in an ancient vision, if you believe your persecution is not an accident but part of a pattern that spans centuries, if you believe the enemy has already been defeated in heaven and is only fighting desperately on earth, this changes how you face your situation. It does not eliminate suffering, but it places suffering within a larger narrative. And perhaps that is what keeps the text alive. It is not just antiquity, it is not just being in the Bible, it is the capacity to speak to different situations without losing specificity. It is symbolic density that accommodates layers without becoming empty. It is the connection between the spiritual dimension and historical reality without reducing one to the other. The 12th chapter of Revelation is not a resolved text. It is not a text upon which there is consensus. It is a text in dispute. It always was. From the first copies with contradictory marginal notes to contemporary academic debates. And perhaps the dispute is part of the meaning, because the text itself describes war, conflict, persecution, resistance, and the history of its interpretation replicates this pattern. Readings in conflict, traditions in tension, authorities trying to fix meaning, marginal voices insisting on other possibilities, and in the middle of all this, the text remains. The woman clothed with the sun, the red dragon, the child, caught up, the flight to the wilderness, the war in heaven, the persecution on earth, the offspring under attack, preserved in ancient manuscripts, repeated in multiple languages, read by countless generations, and still capable of generating the question, who is this woman? Why is she being persecuted? And what does this mean for today? Perhaps the most honest answer remains, it depends. It depends on whom you ask. It depends on when you ask. It depends on which tradition you come from. It depends on which experience you live. Because the text does not close, it opens, and it continues to open.